Okay guys, we're going to be walking through just some quick tips in terms of how to successfully install some key components inside your computer chassis. This is going to be, for instance, the motherboard, your graphics card, your ODD, and your SSD, and even actually a case fan. So with that, let's actually go into our Corsair 400R chassis that we have here on our table and take a look at actually how things are laid out and show you some of the initial process of getting these parts installed. Okay, so as you can see here, we're on the inside of the chassis. And first tip that I have for you guys is that prior to actually installing your motherboard, I would advise that if you do want to go ahead and install any type of case fans into the system, that you're going to want to go ahead and do this at this time. This is especially important as in certain situations when you have larger CPU coolers and just dealing with the motherboard itself, it's a little bit easier to reach in here and get to these key locations, such as for a top fan or for a back mounted fan. Now if you're using a closed loop water cooling system, it's not so much as an issue because you're going to need to probably access one of these anyways, but keeping that in mind, let's go ahead and just quickly show you how to install a chassis fan. Okay, so here we are. We've got our 120mm chassis fan, which corresponds to the actual fan here type. And we're just going to go ahead and line this guy up. And we want to just go ahead and center it on the 120mm fitting. Now this chassis does support also 140mm fans, but we're just going to go ahead and work with the 120mm. Now once you've gone ahead and centered that up, these are some nicer fans, so they do come with these nice little silicone grommets right here. This is going to be easier to work with than having to hold a screw and tighten up the screw, as well as it's going to go ahead and help us minimize any type of sound, although the chassis in itself does already have actually rubber grommets in place to minimize on vibration. So here we're going to go ahead and thread this through the actual hole. It's going to go all the way through to the other side, and we're just going to go ahead and pull it through. Okay guys, now that we've gone ahead and shown you how to quickly install a chassis fan here, let's proceed forward with actually getting our motherboard installed. But before that, we want to call out something very important, and that's going to be your IO shield. This is included along with the rest of the accessories that come inside the motherboard box. And just like our Wi-Fi Go adapter that goes onto the motherboard to enable wireless, we want to make sure that we put this on installed inside the chassis first, okay? Because you can't put this on after the fact. Now, one important point is you can see right here, this indicates your keyboard and your mouse, as well as top USB ports. The bottom is actually for your analog audio connections, for like your speakers or your headphones. This port always goes on the bottom, this port always goes on the top. So just make sure you orientate that correctly. So from here, I'm just going to go ahead and move into this back corner area. This is actually where the IO shield goes. And you can see that there's actually fittings around this actual IO shield that's going to allow it to snap into place. So let's just go ahead and bring that down there. Just hold it, press it on all four sides, make sure it's all nice and snug, and that's it. I've gone ahead and successfully installed the IO shield. Okay, so next up we have here, we want to just go ahead and call out a little bit of the layout inside of the chassis in reference to your motherboard installation. Now we're using an ATX motherboard, so that generally means it's going to be between 8 to 9 mounting holes. Okay, so you can see here inside the chassis that there's multiple standoffs. This is actually where the motherboard is going to be sitting on top of, and from there we're actually going to screw through the open holes on the motherboard into these actual standoffs that are located on the board. You do want to make sure that your motherboard does have these standoffs already in place. In some rare situations, if the standoffs aren't in there, they're coming included with the accessory bag of screws. You're going to want to make sure to take them out, get them screwed into place so that the board doesn't have any variance between, let's say, the top part of the board where there's maybe integrated standoffs as opposed to the bottom part of the board where you might have to add them. And the main reason being is that in some situations, if you're going with a smaller motherboard, maybe like a micro ATX board, you might not need standoffs, of course, in the lower location. Okay, from here, let's go ahead and actually install the motherboard inside the chassis. We've got our board here. As you can see, we talked about that there's actually these standoffs. So there's 9 of them actually on this board. So we're just going to go ahead and essentially try to align these with the ones that we already have on the motherboard, as well as keeping in mind that the IO shield, this portion right here, we need to also line up with the back in terms of the back of the chassis in the IO shield. So we're going to try to just get this all lined up in place, slide it in there, and sit the board in. And we've got it just about right. And when you can essentially see each one of the holes, exposed and going right through, and you know you've got everything locked into place. So at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and take a screw along with the screwdriver and start screwing this in. Okay guys, now that we've got the motherboard installed, we just wanted to highlight a quick function that we have on our motherboard, and these are specifically these two switches. One's a TPU and EPU. Essentially, one's really easy way to go ahead and increase performance by lightly overclocking your CPU, giving you a faster frequency, and the other one's to go ahead and just give you a little bit lower operating temperatures and help you with power consumption in terms of reducing it. So all we would need to do in terms of enabling it would either be to push that to the right, and you have now the EPU enabled, and if you wanted TPU enabled, push that one to the right. You can't run them both at the same time, so you want to make sure to pick one or the other. Before we go ahead and move to installing our storage devices like our SSD or our optical drive, we're just going to want to make sure we have our chassis fans connected. So we went ahead and we installed one chassis fan here in the back. You just want to make sure that you go ahead and you take this, which is the actual chassis fan connection itself, and go ahead and route it to an actual fan header on the motherboard. Now this motherboard has a total of 6 of them, so you have a lot of different options. I generally try advising though making the connection in proximity to where the fan is located. So as you can see right here, we do have one option right there for you with the chassis fan header, number 3. So all we're going to do is connect it, and we're good to go. Okay guys, next up we're going to be talking about installing some of the storage options that we have inside of our system. And this is going to first cover the actual SSD. Since we're not using a mechanical hard drive, we won't be referencing that, but the actual tray that we'll be utilizing covers both. So let's go ahead and move over to the chassis. So we can see here, this is our entire area where you actually would normally mount your hard drives. These are removable trays, so they're toolless. So I can just go ahead and clip on them, pull it out, and that's it. So let's go ahead and take one of these guys. So here you can actually see that there are 4 points. This would accept a standard 3.5-inch hard drive. We go ahead and essentially pop that open, mount the hard drive there, clip it in place, and I can go ahead and mount that back in. For our purposes though, we're going to be utilizing an SSD, and this actually design is very flexible. It supports both an SSD and a 3.5-inch hard drive. This is a little bit smaller at 2.5 inches. What we're going to go ahead and do is flip this over. And you can see that there are 4 screw holes, okay? And if we flip our SSD over, we can see that there are 4 screw holes as well on this Corsair SSD. Now, a majority of SSDs will all come included with the screws that are required to mount them to wherever you are, as well as you can go ahead and double check inside the accessory case that comes inside with your chassis should also have screws as well. Now, keep in mind that the orientation is going to be important. Now, in terms of us being able to install this back in, we need to keep in mind that we want to have the data and the power connections going onto the inside of the chassis. So we wouldn't want to mount the SSD that way. Ultimately, we could run the cables, but it's going to be a little bit more headache to have it try to come out under and then connect this way, whereas if we keep it that way, it's going to be easier for cable management purposes. So keep that in mind. So at this point, let's go ahead and just screw this in. Okay guys, we've gone ahead and successfully screwed all 4 screws in there, so we're good to go. Make sure and keep in mind orientation. So from this point, we're just going to go ahead and move back over there and slide it in. Okay guys, next up we're going to be looking at installing another storage device in our system. We've gone ahead and already installed an SSD, and so now we're going to be taking a look at our optical drive. So this right here is our optical drive. It's a Blu-ray combo drive, so that means it can play back Blu-ray. It can go ahead and play back DVD, play back CD, as well as burn CDs and burn DVDs. So it's pretty robust. It's going to be very straightforward in terms of getting this installed. Keep in mind this is the front part of the actual ODD. This is the actual eject button. And in terms of the actual data and power connections, they're here on the back. So what we're going to go ahead and do from here is take a look at the front side of our chassis. It's very straightforward. All we're going to need to do is on the inside of the chassis, we're just essentially just going to hold on this part inwards, and then we're going to push on one of these parts here, and it's going to pop out. At that point, all we're going to do is take this chassis and slide it into here. So let's go ahead and slide it in, and you're going to hear a lock, and at that point, now your ODD is installed. Okay guys, next up is one critical item in terms of setting up and installing your system correctly, and that's going to be the installation of the power supply. Now earlier we noted that we specifically went with Corsair's AX 650 watt power supply because one, it was quiet, 2, it gives us high quality power delivery, but 3, because it's modular. This is going to go ahead and save us a lot of time and effort in terms of cable management. But one of the things that I've kind of seen with some individuals is that even though they're modular, they decide to go ahead and unbox everything and connect actually all the leads. What you want to do is, before you actually get ready to install the PSU into the chassis, you want to go ahead and make sure to set aside all the cables that you're going to need specific to your system. And there's going to be ones that you're going to have, and then there's going to be ones that of course are optional. So an example would be, if we take a look here at the cabling, we've got this large one, and they specifically, so of course, say the model number and everything like that. This one we know is going to be the motherboard power, so we know we need to set that one aside. We would need one for our graphics card, because we're not going to be using the integrated video. If you were using integrated video, you wouldn't have to worry about this cable, because it would be powered directly by the CPU and the motherboard power connections. So essentially, this is where your checklist would come in handy in terms of just looking at all the components you have. Do you have just one SSD? Do you have an optical drive? Do you have a graphics card? And account for that in needing those connections, and looking at the instructions and the documentation to make sure that you're pulling out the leads for each one of these. Such as an example, this one right here, this is a different type of connection head, which would be specifically for, let's say, like an optical drive or an SSD or a mechanical hard drive. So with that, let's go ahead and actually get this power supply installed into the chassis. So here we've got our 650 watt power supply. So one thing to take into consideration for the power supply that we have is going to be that some power supplies do have a fan on them, and you do want to keep in mind that you don't want to have the fan firing downward unless it's explicitly noted actually within the documentation that that's going to be the way that the fan is recommended in terms of its orientation. Okay. Now in this area, you can see right here that there's an actual little lip. This lip is to go ahead and help the actual power supply kind of firmly be in place. And you can also see that a nice touch inside this Corsair chassis is that there's actually 4 rubber grommets that are underneath to help to absorb any type of vibration that might occur, and also give us a little bit more of a snug fitting. So from here, all we're going to need to do is take this power supply and go ahead and move it in there. So let's go ahead and do that. Just going to go ahead and angle it in there. Make sure it's pressed up entirely against the back, and that's it. You've now successfully installed that. There will be 4 screws that do come included inside with the chassis, that at that point you will go ahead and need to screw in here in the back to go ahead and have it firmly tight in place. Next up, in terms of actually installing items within your system, is going to be the graphics card, and that's what we're going to be talking about at this point. Now, we initially noted in terms of the components that we were going to be setting up for this system, that we were utilizing a DirectCU 770 graphics card. Now, if you were utilizing the integrated graphics, so the ones that are built into the actual the CPU itself, then you can use the actual video connections that are on the back of the motherboard. But since we're using a discrete graphics card, and that's what we want to drive not only our games, multimedia, but the desktop, this is going to be the focus in terms of where the graphics connectivity is going to be. So with that, let's take a look here at the card. We've got it. The most important part that we're going to be focusing on right now is going to be this. This is the physical interconnect. This is the PCIe Express interconnect itself. So from here, we're going to go ahead and move over to our motherboard and show you where we're going to be installing it. So you can see right here at the top, there's a long blue slot. This is the physical by 16 Express slot. So this is where we're going to be installing the graphics card. While you do have other slots that actually mirror the same length and physically would be able to accept the card, this is going to be the recommended slot positioning for the card, okay? So with that, let's go ahead and take our card. You can see that we've gone ahead and already removed the actual brackets that would obstruct us from being able to successfully install it. Just going to take it, line it up, push in until we hear the snap of the retention clip on the back of the PCI Express slot, and from there, the graphics card has been now successfully installed. At that point, we do have 2 screws that we will go ahead and actually screw in to this portion to make sure that the actual card is physically held in place. Now keep in mind that there are some power connections, just like the power connections that are also going to be connected on the power supply, but we'll be covering those when we get to the actual cable management section.